The following episode depicts a polar bear attack that got so out of hand that it would endanger the lives of nearly 80 people and would tragically result in the brutal death of a young man. This is the true story of Horatio Chapple's fatal encounter with one of our planet's most feared predators. Polar bears are some of the rarest and most feared animals on the globe. And although there have been just 20 fatal reported attacks on humans, each one serves as a testament to just how dangerous these formidable predators can be. Spitsbergen is a small island situated within the Arctic Ocean between Norway and Greenland. This snowy, mountainous, and undoubtedly beautiful landscape is one of the coldest and most desolate places inhabited by humans on our planet. This land is mostly untouched, and it's renowned for having 47 incredibly scenic national parks and over 2,100 glaciers. The island nevertheless remains a popular tourist destination for outdoor explorers, and considering its unmatched view of the Aurora Borealis or Northern Lights, not to mention its plethora of unique Arctic wildlife, it's no wonder why. However, traversing the icy outback of this stunning location also has its undeniable drawbacks. Throughout its history, Spitsbergen has been plagued by thousands of severely malnourished polar bears, who are known to act especially aggressive towards humans. The vast emptiness of the island's ice sheets allows for very little food, and so polar bears will consume pretty much anything in sight in order to get by. In fact, the danger of a potential attack is so prevalent here that it's actually illegal to leave the island settlements without a gun. It's also worth mentioning that 5 of the aforementioned 20 known fatal attacks have either occurred in Spitsbergen or its surrounding archipelago, most of which unsurprisingly occur with unarmed or ill-prepared tourists. On the 23rd of July 2011, a group of young explorers set out on a 1-month expedition to the island. Among the group were mostly British university students aged 16 to 25, led by several Arctic survival experts from the British Schools Exploring Society. This charity foundation aimed to provide adolescents with a unique experience by taking them on nature tours to some of the world's most remote ecosystems. And at the time, the organization had a squeaky clean record with 80 years of nothing but successful expeditions in its resume. The explorers eagerly began setting up camp, excited for the journey ahead of them. For many of them, not only was this their first true outdoor experience, but it was a strong opportunity for personal growth, as overcoming the adversities and unpredictability of living in the wild and in such conditions is of course no easy task. This particular excursion, however, would right off the bat go much less smoother than the prior ones, as the group would early on realize that they were short on certain supplies. To top things off, the tripwire system designed specifically to alert them of and ward off wild animals would prove to be too short to stretch around the full perimeter of their camp. Not to mention it had some key setup components missing, rendering it useless. And to put the cherry on top of their problems, they then realized that there also weren't enough pen flares for each person, adding to their concerns about their lack of preparation in case things did go south. Despite their concerns, the group would decide to carry on with the expedition regardless of them. The 2 camp leaders were Mike Reed and Andrew Ruck. Andrew had previously spent over a year in the Arctic, and they never once during that time saw a polar bear, and were furthermore confident that even if they did happen to encounter one on this trip, it would likely get too intimidated by their sheer numbers and scare away. For the first few days, things would go just as planned, and the group went about their daily activities of hiking, fishing, animal spotting, and playing games, and by all accounts everyone was having a blast during this time. Little did they know, however, that in just a few hours, the expedition was about to take an extremely dark turn. It's early in the morning on August 5th, and much of the camp is still asleep. One of the young expeditioners, 17-year-old Horatio Chapple, is the first to emerge from his tent and start his day. He unzips the entrance to his tent, and as to not disturb his still slumbering peers, he quietly leaves his tent. And it was at this point that before he could even stand up for a morning stretch, a 250-kilogram polar bear suddenly slams him to the ground from behind, instantly knocking the air out of his lungs and causing him to violently plummet to the cold hard ground. As he turns around to see what hit him, the ferocious bear then proceeds to gouge at his face and his neck with its powerful claws, causing a spike of adrenaline to surge through Horatio's veins as he begins screaming for help. He then, with all his might, struggles to somehow squirm around and pull himself out from underneath the crushing weight of the polar bear. And with nothing but his bare hands to defend himself, it was at this point that Horatio likely lost all hope, as the mighty polar bear then rises and stands up on its hind legs, grabs a hold of the helpless teenager, bites into his torso, and then begins to violently hurl him back and forth in the air like a ragdoll, brutally ending his life before the eyes of his horrified companions. Despite the brutality the group had just witnessed, the seemingly bloodthirsty polar bear then slowly turns its head to one of the helpless boys in Horatio's tent, 16-year-old Scott Bennell Smith, and proceeds to charge at him, swiping at his head with an amount of force that could very easily crush a human skull. Mike and Andrew barreled towards Scott's location, armed with a rifle and some rocks. Andrew then throws a large stone at the animal to distract it, while Mike scopes for a headshot. The relentless polar bear would then lunge at Mike and bury its teeth into his head, and the other mortified campers watch helplessly. With the aid of his fight-or-flight response, Mike would then fight through the pain and back up far away enough to line up another shot, which is when he finally pulls the trigger, fatally striking the polar bear's head and finally putting an end to the gruesome attack. Both Scott and Mike were in critical condition after the attack and were desperately in need for medical assistance with their head wounds. And since they were too far away to be accessible by ambulance, they would have to wait for a helicopter to come all the way from mainland Norway. The chopper would, however, arrive at the scene quite quickly and would thereby successfully transport Scott, Mike, Andrew, and a fourth injured expeditioner named Patrick to the hospital. Mike would suffer the worst of the injuries from the survivors and would require surgery to remove the teeth that the bear had lodged into his skull. An autopsy on the polar bear would reveal that most of its teeth were in fact rotten, and it was, as they had assumed, severely malnourished and underweight. Unfortunately, despite strong efforts by rescuers and eventually doctors once he had been flown into the hospital, Horatio would have no chance of being saved, as his neck and face had been so badly maimed that doctors concluded that he had likely died of rapid blood loss caused by the vital injuries he'd sustained during the brutal mauling. Despite this tragic outcome, his peers would go on to regard Horatio as a hero, and this is because his desperate screams for help, coupled with his heroic display of courage to stand up and face the bear with all that he had in him, likely distracted it for just long enough that he stopped it from fatally attacking his peers. And had Mike been unsuccessful in gaining his composure to fire the gun, who really knows how much differently things could have turned out for the expedition. The UK police would launch an investigation into the incident, leading to the discovery of some apparent negligence on the part of the organization that could have very easily been avoided. It was found that the expedition leaders had requested just 2 hunting rifles, one of which was so old that it dated back to World War II. It was found out that the leaders had failed to set up a night watch to ensure the safety of the campers during the expedition, not to mention the aforementioned crucial lack of vital supplies, such as the tripwire alert system. Despite the lack of protocol for taking on such a high-risk endeavor, the expedition leaders nor the British Schools Exploring Society would end up facing prosecution for the incident. Horatio's parents would go on to start a charity organization called Horatio's Garden in memory of their son, and the charity would go on to build 6 more such gardens around the UK, with more under construction to this day. Upon visiting these gardens, many people would remark that their atmosphere and calmness gives them a sense of peace, inspiration, and happiness, which is exactly how people that knew him would, by all accounts, report feeling from Horatio whenever they'd be in his presence. If this episode piqued your interest, then our last episode about a fatal Nile crocodile attack which occurred with a doctor named Richard K. Root, is likely to do the same. You can find it on the end screen of this video.